A super quick note before we jump in today. You might notice some minor audio disturbances in this episode. We're working on it and appreciate your patience. Just wanted to give you a heads up about that. Now, let's get into it. Up until 2022, the grief I was most intimately familiar with was associated with the loss of my mom. From her cancer diagnosis in 2014 until her death in 2018, I endured the slow agony of watching a loved one fade away. Following her death, I understood the deep, wrenching pain of not having my mom accessible anymore. I missed the simple act of calling her during my drives, the comfort of someone who understood me completely in a way no one else ever could. It was absolutely agonizing having to rewrite my narratives, knowing my mom was not going to be a part of it anymore, or at least not in the way I want her to be. So when my sister unexpectedly died in 2022, after the initial shock, screams, and quite literally throwing up that occurred, I had a thought of, I've done this before. I've done this with my mom. I know what grieving feels like. I could not have been more fucking wrong. Within 12 hours of hearing the news that my oldest sister, Sarah, died of an overdose, I scheduled an emergency session with my grief therapist, who I've been seeing since before my mom's death in early 2018. I could not tell you what I said to her in that session, but I do remember her looking at me and saying, "You have no idea how this is going to feel for you. It will be completely different than the grief of losing your mom." And she was absolutely right. My sister died a sudden, unexpected death that I was not prepared for. There are definitely traumatic moments through my mom's cancer. And don't get me wrong, losing my mom at the age of 27 really fucked me up. But my therapist was right. The two losses were incomparable. She was also so right in her prediction that I had no way of knowing what my grief journey for my sister would entail or where it would lead me. Today, we will be talking about the very challenging and often isolating different forms of grief, including complicated and traumatic loss. These types of grief can be intensified and entangled with the traumatic circumstances surrounding the death, leaving a lasting impact. When a death is sudden, violent, or particularly distressing, the grieving process can become interwoven with trauma. So let me talk about vicarious trauma for a moment. It's also known as secondary traumatic stress or secondary traumatization. And what it is the emotional and psychological impact experienced by individuals who are indirectly exposed to traumatic events. So basically, by simply hearing the details of someone else's trauma, you can start to experience actual trauma symptoms. This might involve intrusive memories, intense emotional reactions, and a persistent sense of threat or disbelief. For me, I had a 12-month period after Sarah died that I could not close my eyes at night without seeing her in her final moments. And remember, I was not even there. But through the description of that evening and the direct trauma experienced by my brother-in-law, I became consumed by the details of his experience. Seeing that and only that when I would think about my sister, or again, when I would try to go to sleep. I will also note that vicarious trauma can be a professional hazard for those of us in helping careers. However, even to this day, I've never experienced secondary trauma from what a client has shared with me. So needless to say, this was a very unexpected and distressing experience for me. In this episode, we will be discussing complicated and traumatic grief, including addressing the unique complexities that arise when a death is by suicide, or in my case, an unintentional overdose. The grief following those losses can be really agonizing, often accompanied by feelings of shock, anger, guilt, shame, confusion. Loved ones may grapple with unanswered questions, including, How do we tell others about the circumstances of their deaths, including children? We understand that this is a sensitive and deeply personal topic. Our intention is to offer a space of understanding and validation for those navigating this challenging terrain. Please know that if you are experiencing complicated grief, there is support available. And while the journey may be difficult, you don't need to go through it alone. This is Nothing Happens for a Reason. Hi, Lotus.
Hi.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. Should I just introduce myself?
Yeah, introduce yourself.
Okay. My name's Lotus. I am a licensed clinical social worker, have a private practice, and I work primarily with people who are queer, identify as non-binary, and people with complex trauma and dual diagnosis, substance use and addiction stuff, harm reduction specifically.
Awesome. So why don't we just jump in? Why don't you let us know what your experience with grief and loss has been?
So thank you. When thinking about doing this podcast, I guess starting in order, I feel like there are a lot of different types of grief that come up when conceptually trying to understand what grief means to me. So first, what I think of is my dad, who died when I was about 7, and we could start there.
Yeah, absolutely. How did your dad die?
He was in a car accident. He was super young, so I think he was 26 when he died.
Okay. Do you know about the details of the car accident?
We have stories, I think most families have stories. I don't actually know how much of this is true. I have the newspaper article from when he died about the car accident. So he was struggling with addiction on and off for most of his life. And when he died, apparently the story is that he was sober, and he had heard from a psychic or a palm reader that if he did not get sober, he would die. And so he got sober, but then ended up dying. And I don't know how true all that is. But that's the story. I think he was the driver, and the passenger was a woman who was, maybe he was seeing, and she, again, this is the story, grabbed the steering wheel, and the car flew under a semi-truck. And he died, and she was fine.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Do you remember how you were told that he died?
Mm-hmm. Again, I have another family story. So it's interesting because I don't know how much of this. I had a dream that he died the night before he died. And it's hard for me. There's a lot of my childhood that I don't have strong memories around or very clear memories. So this is something that has always been a memory that I have. And I don't know how much of it was something I created later on or solidified, as I went forward. But my dream, I remember waking up and the dream was a scary dream. In my dream, my dad was being eaten by a bear, and it was kind of ethereal. There's floating houses, and there was some bear, and he was being eaten. It was really scary. And I remember waking up and my mom telling me, and I don't think I had a big emotional reaction to it. I wasn't living with him. They weren't together. I saw him rarely. So it was intermittently a couple times a year, not super often. So it didn't mean a whole lot to my life at the time. So I don't remember the moment she told me, but I remember that dream, and that she told me that the morning after the dream. And then I remember his funeral and running around and laughing with kids because I was a kid. I didn't really understand what it meant.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad you just said that. I was going to ask, do you remember at that age what your understanding of death was, or how it was explained to you by people in your life?
I have no memory of that. What does come up is being I don't know. Okay. I felt he was already gone. I didn't have a deep connection with him. And I have another memory of him that was him being angry at me because I was feeling sad, missing my mom. And it was I was going to stay the night over there. And so it's this kind of, I don't think he knew how to be a parent. And so I don't think I saw him as a parent. So I didn't know what it meant. And then going into my whole life story, but I'm not going to go too far. But there's the next step of that is I went to live with my grandparents a year and a half after that. And so that my mom, I felt grief. I noticed I lost my mom. Whereas with my dad, I didn't feel like I lost him. It was later that I recognized I lost the concept of dad,
Yeah. What was the reason that you went and lived with your grandparents and away from your mom?
so that she could finish school. She was a single parent and she was having a hard time. And I think my grandparents were not supportive of her being a single parent, of having me at all. And they were judgmental of how she was raising me. I was raised living in school buses and at teepees in Santa Fe and the like houseless traveling kind of stuff. And they thought that she was doing not a great job. So they were like, let her come live with us. You can finish school. And that was probably the worst decision. Just for me and my mental health, it was not a great decision. So that grief stuck with me. Like, now I don't have any parents.
Not even having one parent you connect with.
Yeah.
Incredibly hard.
Yeah.
Wow. And so within that, what was that transition like from living with mom, kind of sounds unstable,
but loved. Like,
loved.
Yeah.
Loved, but I guess environmentally maybe unstable.
Yes.
And then living with grandparents. What was that transition like?
It was not great. I lived with my grandfather and his wife, my step grandmother on the weekends, and then my grandmother. My 3 different houses. Throughout the week, I would have a room at each house and go to each person because they were splitting up because none of them felt like they could manage me independently or on their own. So and that was terrible. I remember crying every night, missing my mom. I think that was when, missing my dad, I started listening to Chicken Soup for the Soul every night. I would repeat the same sad stories and cry. And I feel like they put words to however I was feeling at the time.
Did you and your mom stay connected during that time?
I would go see her in the summers, and she missed me a lot. And then she moved up when I was almost in 7th grade. And then my grandpa moved me up to Ashland from California. And then my mom moved up when I was in 7th grade. And so I lived with him and his wife for the 6th grade. So just a lot of moving and weirdness. But her and we talked on the phone, and I know she missed me. And now we've done a lot of healing around that process. But it was pretty terrible.
Oh my gosh. And that environment also doesn't sound stable. You were moving around a lot, even just amongst all the different grandparent pieces
throughout the week. Yeah.
Yeah, that it was almost like one constant transition to another constant transition.
Yeah. And that's also when I started realizing that I wasn't like other kids, or like I didn't have the same family structure, home life, or consistency. And so I got really good at making friends, but not great at keeping friends. So I made a lot of different friends and would just notice their families were different because they had this healthy, safe home environment, and I always felt out of place or weird.
Because often, right, if that's what you know, at some point there's some narrative of realizing that you're different, right? Not like the other kids around. That's grief too.
Yeah, I think before I moved, I noticed that my mom's friends were also single moms, and the kids I hung out with didn't have dads. And so that was maybe part of me not picking up on what it meant to lose a dad, because none of us had dads.
Oh, that's interesting.
And then when I moved to live with my grandparents, I was going to school in an area that was a little bit more like affluent, or it was Montclair in Oakland. So it was like, a mix. But all of my friends had full families, like 2 parents or siblings. And I just remember it feeling often pretty uncomfortable and like not fitting in just in general. So I don't think I could articulate it as like, I'm different because of this. I just noticed that I felt different, and that's been also a narrative I've had my entire life since then, of being like, I'm different than other people, which I think is much less true now than I realized. But it felt very like palpable in my body, and less an identified cause of my family's different, or I don't have what you have. One of the things in reflection that I realized is I didn't have any adults in my life that I trusted. I didn't have any coaches or teachers because I changed schools so often, and I didn't have sports that I did. I didn't have any consistent up through when I dropped out of middle school, and then went to college when I was 16. Like I didn't have any like, I think that's one of the resiliency factors, is like one adult that a kid can trust, even despite all the other stuff. And I didn't have that at all throughout that time. I knew I could trust like my mom, but she wasn't there. And then when she came back in the picture, the attachment had already ruptured so much, and I was like angry, and we did not get along until I moved out.
Yeah. I know you were saying that the relationship with mom was safe and close, and you missed her deeply when you were separated. But I was also curious, even thinking about grief did it ever change to feeling like resentful or angry and feeling abandoned?
I think I didn't, again, recognize it at the time. It came out as like, I hate you. I don't care what you say. I'm going to do whatever I want to do. And that involved me starting doing drugs. That was like the point, right? When I moved back in with her was when I started doing all that stuff. And she tried, I think, she tried to create structure, but she didn't really know me anymore at that point, and I didn't know her, and I didn't give a fuck. I was like, if you tell me what to do, I'm just gonna go do whatever I want to do, and she wouldn't stop me, or like she would try, but it just didn't work. So we were like super. It was really challenging for that whole time, and then we became closer when I moved out, and was no longer really dependent on her from a day-to-day basis. It's like then we could become peers in some way, and then we have healed a lot since then, and now she's my mom again. But it took this like, I don't need you anymore. It was like me rejecting her totally, and me like, I don't need you, I didn't need you, which is ultimately me being like, I needed you.
And so your mom came back and then you moved out.
I grew up in New Mexico. She moved to Ashland. I moved to Ashland the year before that from Oakland. And then, so it was 7th grade, and I was really not doing well. And then had a episode, a stay in the psych hospital. And so kind of changed some behavior at that point, but wasn't necessarily doing better. So when I was 15, I dropped out of 8th grade because I was like not doing well. I ended up doing some homeschooling, and then I went to an alternative school for high school, and then I got my GED. I went to night school kind of thing. And then I moved out when I was 16, and I got my own place, started college, and got a job.
Wow.
A large part of it, I think, was like, I don't want to be dependent on other people. I mean, I ultimately still was. They helped me a lot financially. My mom did. And my grandpa's ex-wife who died left me money for college. So anyway, so I started with help, but I couldn't live with her anymore. But I was like, I'm already working. I want to be able to drink when I want to drink. It was a lot of like fueled by wanting to like do college things when I was not in college.
What was your community like at that point outside of mom?
It wasn't great. I had a couple good, well, one really good friend, and then I was dating a boy in a band who had a bunch of older friends, and so they all had a party house, and so I ended up renting a house next door to the party house that was across the street from the college, and I could walk to my work also from there. So it was like a centralized hub. People were at my house kind of all day, every day, and I just would go. People would be there, I'd leave, and people would be there. So like there was kind of a core group of people, but I didn't feel super connected. It was a lot about drinking and getting high and not actually really doing a whole lot.
Were you still going to school during that time?
I really like school. I always really felt that was a place where I could do good, no matter what. I mean, I was late all the time with everything, but I had the skills to make it work, you know? Yeah, and I liked it, and I was kind of martyry complex. I'm like, I'm 16 and so cool and doing this. And I mean, a lot of it I recognize as trying to get like acknowledgement for what I'm able to do at that age. And I recognize also that I didn't have any real support emotionally. And so felt kind of like I needed to prove myself to get affirmation and acknowledgement for how cool I am. Because all these older people who were doing less than I was were hanging out with me. I was like, don't you think I'm cool? You know?
And not just cool. I mean, you said a few moments ago, also like how good I am, right? Maybe these behaviors I'm doing outside of here are counterintuitive to being, quote, good. But here's this area where I can prove that I'm good. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I started making some closer friends with someone my age who we were like wanted to move up to Portland. So we decided to find a place and go to PCC, and it was going well for a while. I transferred to PCC. I was biking to PCC from my cool Southeast Portland apartment. I felt very, you know, I'm doing it. We're functioning. This starting to make friends, and at some point, I ended up meeting my soon-to-be husband, who introduced me to heroin, and that kind of fucked up that whole living situation and potential friends. And I ended up dropping out of school for a little while after that because I couldn't sustain school using heroin. I did go back and went to school more, but while using, but then dropped out again. So that was less successful. But none of those people stayed connected after that. Like, and there were people I spent every day with for at least a year or two. It just so that there was this big loss there too of nobody actually stayed connected. And I know there's some like a responsibility around me going into using drugs and that I could have gotten reconnected, but it was hard to lose yet another group of people at that point.
Yeah. For the first time, it sounds like that you invested in and was trying to connect with in a different way than you ever really had the opportunity to when you were going to school and moving around a lot. And yeah, feeling like another loss, rejection within that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So significant substance use came in.
Mm-hmm.
And what was the theme of grief and loss around heroin use?
So again, in thinking about doing this podcast, that themes of recovery around mental health and substance use come up so much with grief. I don't know who said this, but there is a quote somewhere that said recovery is grief work, that doing any sorts of healing requires, it really is grieving and going through the processes of all the things that you lost or the futures that were lost or the hopes or some of the permanency of damage that occurs at some points that just feels like there's no coming back from certain things. And that's what death is. That's what, that's what all the things are that have been the most painful, is just recognizing, wow, I've altered my life in a particular way and I can't go back.
Not just like physically, mentally, emotionally.
Yeah. Yeah. There was a point at which the person that I was with, who we ended up getting married when I was 18, briefly, there was a point at which he overdosed in my car. And it was just us, and I had to call the police, and he was turning blue, and I was giving him CPR. It was like terrifying. And I ended up getting arrested for calling the police and having heroin in my car, and took him to the hospital. And something that happened for him was that they Narcaned him and saved his life, but ultimately it felt like he never was the same. He was out for a long enough period of time where I don't know if whatever permanent damage it did, but from that point on, he kind of changed. His personality changed, and then that kind of steamrolled. At some point, he started to have hallucinations and then became schizophrenic. And he was the first relationship I had had that was my best friend. Like, despite introducing me to drugs, so much in common and sense of humor. So we had so much fun together, and he was my best friend. And then after he overdosed, I felt like I lost him, but we stayed together for another 2 years or so as that progressed and got worse and worse and worse. And ended up moving back to New Mexico to get off of heroin and to try to rebuild. And he did not do well. And so we were again, alone, didn't have any community there, didn't have any people. I was working and going to school. He was going to school, and I was doing most of his homework for him because he was just not doing well. And you love school so much. And I can do both of our homework. Not great, but yeah. Yeah, so that just got worse. I didn't know how to deal with that loss, and I ended up connecting with a neighbor that had just had his girlfriend die in the apartment, and him and I connected and ended up getting together, and I was 19, and that was my way of coping with, I can't deal with this. I don't know how to leave him because of where he was at, and I felt so guilty, but I also couldn't take care of him. And that was the role I felt like I was pushed into at that point. I couldn't grow or change or do anything with the way that he was.
And so you eventually left that relationship, officially?
Yeah, and this ended up having a baby with the neighbor who was just coming out of this intensely traumatic situation where his girlfriend had overdosed in their apartment. And so he was going through all this trauma stuff, and we were together for a short period of time before I got pregnant.
Yeah, it's screaming trauma bonding.
It was not a good relationship, and it was very trauma bonded. He was an alcoholic and really mean, a lot older than me at the time. So didn't go super well.
Why do you feel like trauma bonding temporarily served you during that?
Yeah, it was the only way that I feel get out of that relationship, which I feel awful about. And I feel like I have so much guilt. And also I've done some amends and worked through a lot of the guilt around what I did and how young I was and how much I was struggling with. I don't know how to take care of myself, let alone this person who is psychotic and doing kind of scary things on a regular basis. And so that connecting with this person, I was like, oh my, you're suffering so much. And I can see that. But yeah, it served me a lot. I mean, I have a baby, and I now have a 12-year-old because of that. And she's amazing. It brought a lot of hard things, but it also was really, really a pivotal moment where I needed to change something. And then connecting with this person in that way and seeing what he was going through was in some ways my distraction and also in some ways what I needed. So we stayed together through the pregnancy. We lived in New Mexico. My daughter was born there. And then we decided to move back to Oregon, to Ashland, to live with my mom or get support because we had a baby then. And we broke up about 3 months after we moved there because his drinking got worse and worse. And yeah, that didn't feel like a loss at the time. I was grateful that it was over because of how hard it was on a kind of continuous basis. But as time has gone on, I just recognize the repeated patterns around my daughter now has no father and the loss of a lifetime, you know, like all of the things that you lose when you lose that role or that person in your life. So I feel that grief on a pretty regular basis for her and for me, because I realized how angry I was afterwards that he didn't participate or help financially, physically, emotionally, anything. And so that's been a huge grief, followed by more griefs around a similar thing with the next person I was with.
How do you talk to your 12-year-old about the parallels, if you do?
Yeah, we've had some conversations. It's been hard to talk about. I think in the past I've been less able to articulate how I feel because I have so much guilt. There's like so much shame and guilt about me doing to her what I had gone through and how awful that was for me. And I just remember, again, that feeling different, feeling alone, feeling abandoned, feeling angry at my dad. How could he die and leave me? Like, how could he do risky things? Or how could he make these choices when he had 4 kids? Like, how could he do that? So there's a lot of anger. And so when I think of talking to my daughter about it, I'm like, how could she not be super angry? And she's at the age now that I was when I discovered my anger. As she's gotten older, I've been like, yeah, I probably need to talk about this more or acknowledge it more. So we've had some conversations where I just let her ask questions versus me trying to create a narrative because I know I have one and I don't want to send a message about who he was to her. He's not dead, as far as I know. We've tried to track him down and have been unsuccessful. So it's hard to be like, I don't know, you know, so, but she's already gone through, like, I don't have a dad.
Yeah. That's incredibly hard.
Yeah.
To like see it replaying, as you said, the parallels of both of that. Mm-hmm. And I love what you said about trying to be mindful about not putting your narrative on her.
Yeah.
Because I think in a broader scope, we do that a lot with, life in general, but specifically with grief, we do that around, okay, we've lost the same person, so we must be experiencing the same thing. And we don't often give people a chance to express or share their own experience as we put that narrative and that experience on the other person. And so I think it's really beautiful that you are mindful of not doing that to your daughter and giving your daughter a chance to share her own experience. So powerful.
Yeah, I try. It's like work in progress. I think I immediately get like I don't want to say anything bad about him. I think that's kind of one of the main things. I don't want to frame it in a negative way about him and that it's okay for you to want to meet him. It's okay for you, even if you know that there are some things about him he hasn't shown up. I think one of the harder things is when there's someone who's alive who doesn't choose you, who doesn't want to see you.
Yeah.
Which feels really different than someone who's not alive who can't see you.
Yeah. It's that disenfranchised type grief. And the person physically, at least you said you think, is alive. And we still grieve people who are living and breathing every single day for lots of different reasons.
Yeah.
And I think with that too, going back to even like your substance use, it sounds like there was an internal process for you around like grieving parts of yourself during that period. I don't know how aware like your mom was of your substance use at the time and maybe grief that she was experiencing.
Yeah, I think that she was terrified. She didn't know for a long time, or for at least a year or so when I was living in Portland, because I was not seeing her. She still lived down south. So, she's identified that she's felt like she didn't want to see her and that I was busy and I was doing my own thing. And so she was trying to give me space. I was 17 when I moved up here. So I think she never felt like she could step into the role of parent. So she tried to just respect my space instead of trying to tell me what to do. And then at the point when I needed to tell her. It was like I could not manage. I was struggling so much. I lost multiple jobs and failed out of school and, trying to get sober and needed money all the time. It was just not working out. It's interesting when you start doing drugs so young, or like start using or drinking or being an adult at 12. I didn't feel like I had an identity to lose. I didn't have a sense of who I was before. So part of my recovery process now is grieving the fact that I didn't ever have an adolescence. So I didn't develop a sense of who I was outside of my trauma or outside of my substance use or outside of my chaos. That's who I've always been. And so when I've taken those things away, I've been like kind of terrified to be like, who's underneath? What if I'm empty? What if there's nothing there when I get those things out of my life?
Yeah, who the fuck am I? Yeah. And so what was that process of figuring out who you are?
Yeah, I feel like it's been a long thinking where to start. So just briefly, like after that, I ended up moving, back to Portland ultimately, eventually. And I had my daughter, and then I met my ex, who I ended up with for 7 years. Who descent into madness, I guess, would be the way I'd describe the relationship. Ultimately ending in a lot of scary things happening, and him in a restraining order, and a lot of undesirable, really traumatic situations for my kids and for me. And so then at that point, I had a second kid, and I started working in the field. I got my bachelor's degree, and I had been working in residential treatment for addictions, and I had stopped using heroin and meth long before that. I'd been on methadone for a while and got off methadone. And throughout this process, I don't identify as someone who's in recovery, like AA recovery, because I never did that. I was not welcome in a lot of those spaces at that point because I was on methadone. Didn't ever connect with the idea. So I had different relationships with different substances from a harm reduction perspective, on and off. So it's always like creating a meaningful life worth living. And what does that look like? And at that point, when I would say in 2015, 16, I ended up in that relationship. I wanted a family. I had one kid. I was alone and single. And so I wanted a family. And because that's something I never had. And there was a lot of craving for family. And that's when I found this person who was very family oriented, apparently, or seemed to be. And ultimately, then after 7 years ending in that, a couple years after that is where any real deep recovery, I think, has taken place. Before that, I stopped using drugs and made a lot of change and was healthy in some ways. But I don't think there was a depth to my recovery process. The grief hadn't really set in until after the end of this relationship, when I really was like, oh, this is what PTSD is. I've had a lot of trauma and shitty things happen in, complex ways that haven't necessarily caused an acute effect. It's all fucked up my sense of identity or what's normal or belief systems in more complex ways. But this relationship and how that ended was, I'm like shaking all the time. I can't eat. I can't function. I am unable to think or articulate. Like, it really impacted me in a way that felt very much non-functional, or I just had never actually experienced that in the way that, like, it feels like TV or the media portrays it. And I was going through the loss of my house, of that relationship, of family, of safety in my body, sexually, physically. One of the threats that he would make that I stayed for was he would say my kids wouldn't have a dad and that would be my fault. And so if I left and them not having a dad would be my fault. And so there was me holding on to family and like that idea for a long time because of that.
Well, in some ways it feels like this person knew you so deeply that he knew exactly what to say to manipulate part of that decision making, right? Like, in some ways, kind of where it started for you, the narrative of not having a dad for you, and how that fucked up so many different views of family and relationships for you. And then to use that, well, your kids won't have a dad then. It's horrible. Yeah, so manipulative.
Yeah. And what changed for me was the point, he said something in one of the last interactions we had ever had, before a year of court cases back and forth and hearings. He said that he was going to get my kids taken away from me and make me lose my job and my career. And he looked me in the eyes, and I believed that was what he was going to do. And there was like a piece where I was like, think just realized how all of these ideas about him and my kids losing a dad, I'm like, oh, all the things are wrong. None of the things I thought were true about him are true. Like, these are all manipulations. And him threatening to have my kids lose me, that shifted something for me. And that was the turning point where I saw him really differently and was able to make a decision to actually never go back.
So there was empowerment that came from that.
Yeah.
I think going back to another important narrative, recovery can mean so many different things. And I think it's obviously, like you said, important to name the very black and white way people view recovery. But I think that when you said, you never did the 12-step thing because you weren't welcome in a lot of those spaces being on methadone at the time. And that's part of the history of so many people with, medication-assisted treatment and things like that. But that be a common thread in your story too. Like, I don't belong. I'm different here. I'm other.
Yes.
And even you trying to do something good for yourself and having this community that's here, and you're like, we maybe have similar goals, and I'm trying to make changes, and I'm trying not to, abuse substances anymore to cope with my grief and trauma. And those people in that room maybe are doing something similar, but there's still something that's making me different. And not just in your head, right? Like, especially at that time, there's probably majority of people that would say you don't belong in here. And that just continued to reinforce that foundation for you. You don't belong here.
Yeah, I think that's really accurate. Like a sense of not belonging anywhere, which was a lot of the cause for my drug use, I think, and like ways to not feel that so much, or like not feel like I needed to be a person to belong. I just could use drugs or drink and belong. And that was the way that I found any sort of belonging, was without other people who are also not belonging and doing those things. I think doing drugs not only helped me not care that I didn't belong, but also feel safe in my body, or feel like I could belong in my body without needing to feel a lot of things that I didn't want to feel or cope with. And then being in certain relationships, and I definitely recognized that pattern in relationships was similar. I didn't have to feel empty or like I didn't belong in my body or in the world. And then having a family meant that I belonged somewhere. I had a role that was important. And so getting to my next loss or grief was like, before I ended that relationship, which was about, I think it was a few months before the end of that relationship, my best friend, Opal, died by suicide in early 2021 after COVID. There was so much going on, and we would see each other not a bunch. Recently, we've been friends since middle school. We were like disconnected for a little while, and I started doing drugs. And then when I moved back to Ashton with my daughter, we both had kids at the same age. So we started hanging out a lot more and reconnected. And she's just one of my favorite people in the world. And she had a lot of trauma and hurt that she was going through on a pretty regular basis. But we connected over that. That was a lot of, we could be ourselves around each other. And so she was one of the most beautiful in and out people, such a good heart. And so when she died, I found out on Facebook because I wasn't friends with any of her friends. She stayed in Ashland after high school, and we were in connection. We talked on the phone. I found out a lot about her personal life, and I told her a lot about my personal life that nobody knew, and she would tell me things that nobody knew, and I knew she was suffering in silence in a lot of ways. But we had this connection over being able to just tell each other honestly what was going on and not being able to really tell other people. So the night she died, she texted me, "I love you." And I didn't see it till the next day. And so I was on Facebook and saw that people posting, like, "Oh, I miss you so much, Opal," all these people on her Facebook page. And I was just super confused, and then kept following and realized that she had died. And then I realized that she had sent me that text right before she died. I was not doing well. That was like right toward the end where everything was peaking in this like abusive relationship. And when it hit me, I like could not believe it. Like it affected me much more than I even realized it could. I was obsessing over her, printed out hundreds of pictures of her, pinned her messages, and was like going back and reading through them and just making myself sad, like so attached to exposing myself to it so that I could keep feeling it because I didn't want to forget or something. I was crying all the time, and I knew she felt really stuck in certain things in her life. So that led to me being like, I am going to kill myself if I stay in this relationship. Like, I'm not going to make it out alive. And I feel like that was this turning point where then he started changing and becoming scarier. And so both of those things happening And like, because I knew that she was in such a similar emotional place as me, just that depth of stuckness.
Yeah. You said a lot of what you experienced with the obsession piece of it. What are some other things that you remember during that time for you?
To be honest, I think it was the first time I had felt anything, like really felt anything in a long time. I had been really dissociated for a really long time and hit the ground, like feeling it. And I just felt the world was changed forever. And it was interesting because it was in COVID at this time where the world was changed forever for so many, for everybody. And I couldn't believe it. And I could, like, the world felt different. Walking around, it was empty or there's missing things. We weren't even spending that much time together, interacting that much, but it felt like I could feel that it was different without her in the world. Her energy was literally missing and gone, and that wasn't right. I felt like I found myself stuck there or like staying there for a lot of the time. I think it was making me feel something, when I think my way of coping with the relationship and how unhappy I was and how so much felt wrong in my life and for my kids. But once I felt that I had to leave, once I stayed with the feeling, I was like, oh my God, I cannot feel this and keep being in it. There was that cognitive dissonance felt too strong. So it was so awful, but also if I hadn't have felt anything, I think I wouldn't have done anything different. I would have stayed dissociated and just kind of numbing out as much as I could.
Did you share with your daughters about Opal dying?
Yeah, that was something that I think in that moment I didn't know how to communicate it. And I still am not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure if I did the right thing. I was so in shock and they were like, what's wrong? And I was like, my friend died. I didn't know how to tell her why I was crying all day constantly and couldn't focus on anything. And so my younger daughter, I think, asked questions later about it. And I was tried to explain it in a more like simple way of like, sometimes people are just hurting too badly to be alive and make choices to stop hurting that is really hard for other people. So yeah.
How do you think people should talk with their children about death and grief and loss? Having both you as a 7-year-old losing your dad and having the experience of however people chose to tell you, and then you have the experiences where you've had to share with your kids hard things and losses that have happened. What do you think is important for people to know about it?
I think one of the main things is just not to pretend it's not happening. So sometimes maybe I have erred on bringing it up or talking about it, maybe not perfectly, but to me, I've been like, I can't not talk about it, or I can't not make it okay to talk about or be honest about how something's affecting me, and not mean to go into detail, but being like, yeah, I'm like not okay, or like I'm hurting a lot because of this, or it's okay to feel really sad sometimes, because I think I didn't hear people talking about it when my dad died. I didn't hear other adults talking about grief. I didn't really see people, it wasn't presented as an okay thing to really talk about until people put me in therapy and were like, okay, what do you think about your dad? I'm like, I don't know who you are.
So talking about it, being honest, while also choosing the words or how much you share, or wanting to create an environment that just it's okay to talk about it, right? So I think that's something about, especially, right, the American culture, grief is taboo to talk about. And then we had another triple layer of it's taboo to talk about with kids. And I don't know how many people I've talked to, whether clients or in the grief group I used to run, or the grief group I used to attend, where we'd sometimes have this conversation of like, how did people share about a death with you as maybe if you were younger, or how do you share about it with your own kids? And that seems to be pretty normal for people who've experienced loss.
Yeah.
Like, we need to be able to talk about it, because the people who've had experiences where they didn't grow up in a family or a culture, how hard that is too. I've met so many people who, as kids, they were told they couldn't go to the funeral because they're too young to go to it. Or people just like straight up lying about what happened to somebody and they find out later.
Yeah.
And so we just make these decisions, and so often, right, people are doing the best that they can. And I think that being able to normalize, it's important to talk about these things. And that's what I love about, organizations like the Dougie Center, where it's allowing spaces for kids to talk about really hard things in their life where the outside world doesn't know how to support it. It's uncomfortable and leaves people feeling so fucking alone.
Yeah.
I remember I listened to a podcast 10 years ago and they were talking about, how great it is to have this community where kids can go. And this like 7-year-old, one of his parents died by suicide, and he was going to this organization and learning about death and loss and how processing it is really healthy and needed. And then he would go to school and somebody, teacher, other kids would ask what happened to your dad. And like, my dad killed himself. And the story was the 7-year-old got suspended from school.
Oh my God.
Because he was talking about death. And that, clearly it's been probably over 10 years since I heard that story. That stuck with me because it's just so infuriating. And again, we're just reinforcing this really horrible message.
Yeah.
Don't talk about it. And if you talk about it, you might get suspended from school. You might make people uncomfortable.
Yeah. Which, fuck that. Yeah. God, yes. Yes. So I have like a more recent experience with that. My older daughter had a boyfriend, a boy that she was dating, or quote, air quote, I have to air quote because she was 11. And they're for like a year. So they were like good friends. But his sister died by suicide in the middle of the time they were seeing each other. And his mom called me that morning and told me, and I was like, how do I tell my daughter? Because we were getting closer to their family. She was 15, maybe 16, but just too young. And so I didn't know how to talk to my daughter about it. And so I was texting my mom about it, and she had my iPad, and I didn't realize that she had my iPad. And so she read my text message about it and came into my office and was like, is that true? And it just was such an awful way to find out, not having someone tell her. And so, then I didn't have a choice or like the timing of it or feeling ready to have that conversation. I don't think there was anything I could have done differently after that, or I would have done differently after that. But it was so hard. And my daughter, this was last summer, and she's still cries often, like there are many days that she just cries about it. And it's so sad because, well, for obvious reasons, but also she started doing the same thing, like downloading all these pictures of her and printing them out and looking at them and writing about her. And I think it really did something to her. And so now whenever people joke about, oh, I just want to kill myself, it really upsets her. And so there is also, kind of this narrative around the suicide being an extra layer, like, right, talking to kids about it, but then talking to kids about suicide and how to talk about that and how to talk about it with other adults. And so I found a support group for people who would love someone who died by suicide. And it was hard to find. It felt like a niche group, and people talked about how hard it is to explain, and so many people feel angry at them and the complications that come with that, and how that feels also very specific. Yeah, I think it was through maybe a referral through the Dougie Center, but I was like, I need other people. Because so going back to when my friend Opal died, I went down to her memorial because nobody could go to her funeral. Her family had it in private because of COVID. I think I still hold some frustration that I couldn't be more involved in the experience. So I went down for the memorial, and they had this big party in the woods where everybody was just wasted. And there was like a bonfire, and nobody at any point said anything about her. Like, nobody said, stop, everybody, let's do a toast to Opal. And I know that that's nobody's specific fault, but it felt like nobody was able to just say it. Like, people were not okay, but so drunk that, like, I couldn't walk. It did feel very like, what are we doing? And it was just so evident that everybody was hurting so bad, but didn't know how to support each other, or like didn't know how to actually come together and make something meaningful happen. So that felt like a big loss. And then for my daughter's experience with this, we did go to the funeral, and a lot of the kids from her school, there was a big group of her friends came and talked, and they just talked about her for a while. And that was so hard. They just told stories about her, and they all were just crying. And so again, I brought my daughter to the funeral because it felt important, and funerals are obviously not for the person who died. They're for everybody else. And so the concept of how to create that is such an interesting and feels very complicated, you know?
Yeah. Right. Because it's each individual person maybe has a different intention or need for that day. And trying to show up in a certain way or feeling like there's a right way to show up. And am I going to cry? Am I crying too much? Am I not crying at all? Are people going to think that something's wrong with me because I'm not crying at all? So much pressure on ourselves in those settings too. I think, like you said, maybe I can lose so much of what the purpose of it is because of the pressure. And again, I think because of just the society that we live in.
Yeah.
Not that there's a right way to do it, but we're definitely not educated and supported.
Yeah.
In what, quote, like healthy grieving.
What literal words to say when talking about it. There's like this empty hole, not only where the person is, but what you're supposed to do with those feelings and how you're supposed to talk about it and who you're supposed to talk about it to.
Yeah.
I think there's some way that grief brings people together. You can feel when you're with someone who's felt grief. You can feel the depth of grief when you talk about it with certain people, and then other people you can tell when maybe they haven't felt it. There's something I think that is a vibe or like a felt experience when you're sitting with someone and talking about grief. There's some place that you've been that they've been to, and like that depth. And I think a lot of people also just avoid ever going there or letting themselves go there.
Yeah. Yeah, something that often would happen for me with different losses, and people would say to me often was, well, I don't want to ask about it because I don't want to make you sad. And every time somebody would say that, I would say, I'm always sad right now.
Yeah.
Like, you don't have the power to actually make me sad. Like, you're not going to remind me that my mom is dead. You're not going to be the thing that reminds you that my sister's dead. And so this avoidance to people not wanting to even like bring it up or even ask a very vague question of like, how are you doing? And then you're like, what the fuck? Like, people have just forgotten about what's going on. Do people not care? All the narratives, at least for me, that I would make out of that.
Yeah. When no one's asking you or no one's acknowledging this really huge thing or that you're going through and have been going through.
Right. And I think it's also having trust in the other person that they can draw their own boundaries and their own limits, right? I'm fully capable of saying, I thank you for asking. I don't talk about it right now.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And that's instead of making the decision for them by just not bringing it up. But don't avoid it.
Yes. Yes.
Don't.
And ultimately, like you said, people can't tolerate it. People are like, it's a lot going on over there. I don't know if I can come over there with you. So I don't want to actually say anything, whether it's because I don't know how or because I don't know how to feel what you're feeling with you. I don't know how to be with you in that. There's so many reasons, and it does feel so big that I think a lot of people are just scared of that. I feel like times when we've been together, it's just been, I'm just here. I don't have anything helpful to say, even, being able to acknowledge that there really aren't any words that I'm not going to leave or I'll be here. That's
so powerful, actually. Yeah. Right. I'm not asking you to take the pain away, or there's no words that's going to make it better. That's not how it works in grief.
No.
There's no taking it away. You actually just have to come be with it. And that's all. That's what it is.
Yeah.
As we're wrapping up, I know we're touching on some, I think, really important pieces, but what are things that you wish people understood about death, grief, loss?
I think my immediate response, or like what comes up first, is I think the most important thing is to just feel it, to allow yourself to feel it, and that sometimes you have to function and like work and do the things you have to do. And we don't live in a society that really gives enough or in very little time for actually grieving and allowing yourself to do it, because you get a couple of days and you got to come back to work and you have to pay bills or else you'll lose your job. And that's going to fuck up your life even more than the grief. will initially, or the loss will, but being able to let yourself feel it, and crying or screaming or running or dancing or whatever the thing is that makes you experience it in your body and like express and process it, I think is the thing we suppress them, just avoid and suppress all the time. And that it feels like we are all running away from grief all the time as a culture, communities, individuals,
Yeah, the importance of feeling. And so the messaging, I think is beautiful, and feel it, experience it, and that there's not a right way to do that. Being present with it, it's not going anywhere.
Yeah. And that it doesn't go away, and that like being able to go inside and love your grief, just like you would be there for a kid who feels sad about something, like being able to relate to your own grief with acceptance and allowing versus hatred. I think that makes such a big difference.
Yeah, wanting to like hate the hard parts of ourselves is also really counterintuitive to healing, but also very conditioned in a lot of us. This is uncomfortable. This is hard. This hurts. I'm going to hate it. I'm going to shame it, versus having that compassionate curiosity for it. Yeah. That's a really important message too. The last thing I'll say is also listening to your story. You speak about so many different ways that grief has shown up for you. Like so much grief is part of your story and part of your narrative, and being able to just name how complicated grief is, and how we sometimes have this very black and white perspective of what grief is, or you can only feel grief if you had this strong, healthy relationship with somebody. And again, the disenfranchised grief feelings around, well, who are you to feel grief for your dad that wasn't present in your life? And being able to express so beautifully here today of there was still grief within that, because it shaped you. 7 is such a formative time of your life, and it shaped belonging, shaped abandonment, shaped these different things that were threads throughout different areas of your life too. And so be able to sit with and honor whatever the grief is from whatever type of relationship it was. There's grief, and we have to hold it, and we have to validate the different types of grief that we as individuals feel. Because when we start like comparing and categorizing and saying yours doesn't matter and mine does, like the comparative suffering part just pulls us further from each other, which then exacerbates the isolation and loneliness that we feel in grief.
Yes.
And so I think acknowledging the common humanity that is part of being human, that's very much part of grief and loss, is so fucking painful, but also the connection that comes from it feels really powerful and beautiful to me.
I agree. Yeah. I feel like that's one of the, like, my history with you has been so much connecting over our grief or our histories and my experiences with you. And like, I think you creating this podcast also does that. It creates the connection through grief.
I appreciate you so much. Thank you so much. Thanks for being here today. Thanks for sharing parts of your story. And just thank you. Thank you. If you or someone you know is struggling with thoughts of self-harm or suicide, please remember that you are not alone and help is available. You can connect with compassionate and trained individuals by calling or texting 988 in the US and Canada, or by calling 111 in the UK. These services are free, confidential, and available 24/7. So please reach out if you need support. So that's all for this week's episode on Nothing Happens for a Reason. Thank you for being here and listening. We'll be back with a new episode next Thursday. And if you find value in these conversations, please subscribe and consider leaving a review. It truly helps others find our community. And if you know someone who might find solace or understanding here, whether they're experiencing grief or seeking to better understand grief, please share this podcast with them. I appreciate your support deeply. Until next time.